Hello, I'll be speaking to you today about participatory research approaches with autistic team members. My name is Nicolaidis, and I am the other co-director of Aspire. I bring my perspective as a physician, professor, participatory researcher, journal editor, and family member. I truly believe that no matter what type of research we do, the reason most of us devote a huge part of our lives to our work is that we truly wish to help people and to make the world a better place. And most of us honestly try to do our best to help our patients, research participants, and communities, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, socioeconomic status, or disability. But unfortunately, report after report concludes that we just don't succeed. And ultimately, what's the point of all the sacrifices we make if our work doesn't truly help the populations we study? Participatory research approaches are meant to reduce some of the long-standing challenges traditional researchers have faced and to try to increase the impact of our work. I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of participatory approaches, and then we'll move on to some more practical considerations. While there are many types of participatory approaches, the main idea behind all of them is that representatives from the community or population being studied become part of the research team, not participants, team members. The goal is to increase the impact of the research, both directly, for example, by making sure we're asking the right questions or disseminating findings to the right people, or indirectly by increasing scientific rigor, for example, by increasing the validity of data collection instruments or creating effective study protocols. Despite whatever incorrect assumptions people may make between participatory and qualitative research, it's important to remember that these are just approaches to research, which can be used with any methods. None of these approaches are new. They've existed since at least the mid-20th century. However, they're relatively new when it comes to autism research. In fact, when we first started conducting participatory research with autistic adults in the mid-2000s, people acted like it was a totally preposterous idea. Luckily, autism research has come a long way since then, with an astoundingly rapid increase in the use of participatory approaches. And I appreciate that the use of at least some form of participatory approach is an expectation of all AARP projects, which is why AARP asked ORIM to create these trainings. Before I say more about participatory research, I wanted to make a note about autistic scientists and scientists in training. It's extremely important to increase diversity, including neurodiversity, in academia and the health sciences. Insider researchers, such as Latinx researchers doing research on Latinx health or autistic researchers doing research on autism, bring wonderful strengths and perspectives. And I can't believe I still have to say this, but no, outsider researchers are not any more objective or less biased. It's just sometimes harder to notice their biases. That being said, just including an insider researcher on a research team does not make it participatory research. Please don't call autism research participatory just because the team includes an autistic graduate student or co-investigator, or even a principal investigator. Unless you think that any women's health study conducted by scientists who are women is participatory. While autistic scientists bring important insights, they cannot represent the full range of lived experiences of autistic people. And of course, as much as we may think we are sharing power, the truth is there are always inherent power imbalances with autistic staff, trainees, or junior investigators. Ultimately, we really need more autistic scientists and greater use of participatory approaches. It's not an either-or. There are many different participatory approaches and this big alphabet soup to go along, but I like to group them into three big buckets based on power sharing. In this first group, the goal is to have equal power sharing in all phases of the research. The second group doesn't necessarily aim for equal power sharing, but it does expect authentic inclusion of community partners with at least some joint decision-making throughout. The third group uses a consultative approach where researchers seek advice or feedback from community members, but it's up to them what they do with this information. Let's talk for a minute about community-based participatory research, or CBPR. While I love CBPR, I worry that the term is often grossly misapplied and overused, especially in autism research. As a reminder, the goal of CBPR is to share power and ownership equally. It's a form of action research, and there is supposed to be a focus on the quote, community as a unity of identity. It's a specific, well-defined research approach with the huge literature outside of autism and a clear set of 9 principles and 4 considerations. Aspire is an example of a partnership that tries to use a full CBPR approach. Dora and I co-founded Aspire in 2006. We're a group of autistic and non-autistic scientists and community partners. Our community partners include autistic people and other stakeholders, such as family members. We've tried really hard, especially in recent years, to partner with autistic people with a wide range of lived experience, including people with and without intellectual disability, people who can and cannot use speech, and people of different genders, sexual orientations, races, and so on. We've collaborated on multiple NIH-funded studies on topics of importance to the autistic community. The way I see it, in CBPR, community partners are there to keep the research respectful, accessible, and socially relevant, while academics are there to keep the research scientifically sound and academically relevant. We work together as equal partners in all phases of the research, from when we're developing a study to when we're implementing it to when we're disseminating the results. But being equal doesn't mean we all do the same things. It also doesn't mean that a specific individual can only be on one side or the other. The truth is that many of us bring multiple perspectives. But it does mean that we work closely together throughout, learning from each other and valuing both professional expertise and lived experience. I also wanted to talk a bit about other participatory approaches. For example, the field of patient-centered outcomes research often talks about patient and stakeholder engagement. This may actually be a more appropriate approach for many types of autism research, as it doesn't assume there's a community, it isn't necessarily meant to be action research, and it doesn't aim for equal power sharing. However, there is an expectation of authentic engagement, with at least some power sharing and the involvement of patients and stakeholders in all phases of the research. Similarly, there's an expectation that there are representatives of organizations, not only individuals. Finally, I wanted to say a word about consultative models, as I think this is actually what most autism researchers mean when they say they are doing participatory research. This includes projects that use advisory boards, Delphi panels, individual autistic consultants, and so on. Here, there's less expectation for shared decision-making or ownership. The inclusion of community members may be throughout the project or at specific times, and the project may or may not involve collaborations with community organizations. There are plenty of times where it's reasonable to use a consultative model. However, you need to use these approaches with great caution. Please do not tokenize people. You may think you're doing a good thing by bringing on some autistic advisors, but you ultimately will do more harm than good. If you're going to use a consultative model, be very clear around expectations so that your advisors fully understand how much power they will or will not have. And just because you're using a consultative model doesn't mean that you're exempt from doing the hard work it takes to effectively include community members in research. You still need to provide adequate training, support, and accommodations, and you still need to focus on collaboration and trust, perhaps even more so. Finally, though it's up to you to decide what you do with what you've heard, you really need to be careful when ignoring advice. Ask yourself, have you truly understood why someone is offering that advice? I can't tell you the number of times I've seen problems arise from academics throwing out advisory board comments without really understanding the underlying issues. So the next thing to think about is who are you talking about when you say community partners or stakeholders? Is it autistic people, family members, disability services providers, clinicians? All of them are important to autism research and bring valuable insights. But please don't assume that non-autistic family members alone can speak for autistic loved ones, even if the project is about kids, non-speaking people, or people with intellectual disability or high support needs. We have found that we often need to bring multiple perspectives, including family members of people who wouldn't be able to participate in a participatory project directly, as well as autistic people with a really wide range of disability characteristics and lived experiences. And then we make a really conscious effort to center the voices of autistic people. Ultimately, if you're authentically using a participatory approach, it should have a big impact on the research itself, including the choice of topics or research questions, the study design, intervention development, recruitment and consent procedures, data collection, and dissemination. You can see lots of concrete examples of how it's affected our Aspire work in the video on inclusion of autistic adults as participants, as well as on our Aspire website. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's talk about how you actually do all this in practice. First, you should think about what participatory approach best matches the context and goals of the research. Be transparent about your approach and expectations, and make sure not to pretend to be doing something you're not. And of course, again, please be careful not to tokenize people. Next, think about what structures make sense for your project. In some cases, like with Aspire or in larger centers, you may need to think separately about the structures that work at an organizational or center level versus those for individual research projects. And think about leadership roles. Will you use an academic and community co-PI model, or perhaps, as we've been doing more recently, an academic PI and a community project lead? Is there a role for a steering committee with academic and community leaders? How are other team members involved? Will you use councils with decision-making power or advisory boards? What is the role, if any, of representatives from community organizations? And of course, think about how to fairly compensate community partners in all sorts of different types of roles. Now, let's talk about assembling a team. There's no one right way to do it, but I would suggest you consider first identifying academic and community project leaders so that you can work collaboratively during the planning process. It's often quite helpful to form connections with organizations, preferably autistic-led ones if possible. And then the academic and community leaders can invite other academic and community partners to the team. The point is that you want people that fit the project's needs. I have to laugh at how many times I've heard academics talk about getting a random sample of community partners. I mean, do you randomly select your statistician? I mean, these are your collaborators, not your study participants. Of course, they need to have an interest and a commitment to the topic that's certainly above and beyond what you would randomly find in the population. At the same time, just as you need to have co-investigators who bring different types of content or methodologic expertise, you need to have diversity of lived experience within the community members of your team. It's also important to have a mix of community leaders and people without significant leadership roles, as they may bring in different perspectives. Finally, not all people make good collaborators. Try to find people who will prioritize the project goals over drama or individual gain. Launching a project effectively also takes a ton of preparation. It's a lot of work, but it's totally worth it. We try to hold individual onboarding meetings with each new partner to establish rapport, review basics, handle logistics, answer questions, and identify individual accommodations. Then we hold one or more initial group meetings to kick off the project. During these meetings, we go over important content such as the project goals, aims, and plans. We also use a variety of exercises, including icebreakers and visioning exercises, to help create team cohesion. And we have explicit discussions about what collaboration practices will help the group be successful. In addition to these types of meetings, we also lead actual trainings as needed. For example, we may have a training for community partners to help them understand some basic scientific concepts and terms that we will use in the project. And we may have a training for the more traditional academic partners to help them understand basic concepts related to neurodiversity, accommodations, and participatory approaches. Finally, this is a good time to create or review formal agreements and policies related to topics such as authorship, presentations, or confidentiality. It's also really important to put a lot of thought into how you will hold effective team meetings, especially if you're including autistic people with a wide range of disability-related needs. Think about how different formats may or may not meet the team's needs. We have used a variety of formats over the years, and the only thing I would strongly recommend against is anything that relies on audio alone, even if you're working with partners who can speak fluently. If possible, in-person meetings are great, but then it's important to think about the sensory environment and to make sure to provide things like fidgets or captioning as needed. We currently hold remote meetings over Zoom with a combination of slides, video, text-based chat, and professional captioning. Preparing for meetings is no small task. We do a lot of background work in smaller work groups that include both academic and community team members, and in science geek meetings so that the academics can debate each other on technical stuff without taking up a lot of space in the full team meetings. Then we send prep materials to everyone about 5 to 7 days before each full team meeting. This includes traditional things such as the meeting agenda and slides, but also a lot of other background information to help make sure that we can actually use meeting time for discussion. We send this background info in detailed, easy read, and compact formats to meet different team members' needs. We also offer optional pre-meetings to review materials with partners who need some extra help. Finally, during the full team meetings, it's absolutely critical to provide very strong facilitation with a clear etiquette, pauses to integrate oral and chat comments, breaks, and so on. Shared decision-making is really key to participatory approaches in both of the first two buckets. But it comes with challenges, especially given different communication styles and power imbalances. This is an area where voting simply doesn't work. Each person may represent an important part of the community. Just because a majority of team members feel one way doesn't mean that you can safely ignore a minority view. Using a formal consensus process can really help. At Aspire, we use what we call our 5-finger consensus process, shown in the figure and on our website, but there are plenty of others. A formal consensus process makes sure everyone has a say, helps clarify what the decision even is, and encourages creative problem solving. It also speeds up the process when more discussion isn't necessary and makes us take more time when it is. Not all work can happen in meetings, so communication between meetings is also important. There are many challenges to using email for such communications, including that we often have to send out a large amount of information and that different team members bring very different background skills and level of interests. It's also sometimes hard to balance the need for transparency and the risk of just overwhelming partners with too much information. Over time, we've developed and refined a structured email format to help. At the top, we have short statements labeled purpose, actions, deadline, stipend, and summary. Then we put the rest of the details in Q&A format in plain language. We clearly mark additional sections or attachments as optional if they're only there for those who want that much detail. And we always offer people the option to review emails over Zoom or telephone with a research assistant. No matter how well you do things, you still need to continuously build and maintain trust. And I promise there is always room for improvement. Even after 16 years of working together at Aspire, we're constantly having to make little and sometimes big changes in real time. We evaluate our partnership in a variety of ways, including quick feedback after each meeting and more in-depth evaluations of project milestones. And then, as we recognize issues, we do our best to fix them. Ultimately, actions speak much louder community partners in all types of dissemination. Don't ever believe that scientific publications only matter to academics. If you're using a CBPR or co-production approach, community partners can and should meet international criteria for authorship, whether or not they can read or write in the language used in scientific journals. But again, that takes work. We offer plain language explanations and comment bubbles or tables and hold one-to-one or group discussions to make sure that community partners fully contribute to and approve papers. Gratuitous authorship, where people haven't met criteria or even necessarily agree with the material in the paper, can be just as bad as excluding partners from authorship. Community members also participate in various types of presentations, and often they're the ones that are taking the lead on dissemination related to advocacy, policy, blogs, newsletters, media, and so on. Before we end, I want to make one last note. While I've been talking exclusively about participatory approaches to individual research projects or partnerships, it doesn't have to end there. In 2017, when I was asked to be the founding editor-in-chief of Autism in Adulthood, I said yes on one condition, that we would make this peer-reviewed journal as inclusive and participatory as possible. It's been amazing to see what happens when we take a participatory approach to shaping the literature. We deeply value the contributions of autistic people throughout, with 12 autistic scholars and leaders on our editorial team and board, in a dual review process where every manuscript gets both a scientific peer review and an autistic review. So far, about a third of the papers we've published include at least one autistic author, which may not sound like much, but it's orders of magnitude more higher than what's in the rest of the literature. These strategies allow us to focus on the most pressing topics and to ensure that our papers use anti-ableist language and concepts. As a relatively new journal, we're still growing really rapidly and would absolutely welcome your involvement. So I've tried to cover a lot in this brief training, but I just want to highlight a few take-home messages. One, participatory approaches are a way to help you strengthen the rigor and potential impact of your research. Sharing power and building and maintaining trust is key. Don't tokenize people or pretend to be doing something you aren't. And remember, actions speak louder than words. Don't underestimate how much work it takes. This is really hard stuff, but I promise it's totally worth it. And of course, the devil's in the details. Please watch the Q&A videos or go to our website for lots more practical tools and tips. I want to thank our full Aspire and AARP teams, as well as the funders for Aspire and for AARP. And don't forget to connect with us.